All right, good morning and good afternoon. This is Karen Glitman with the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, and welcome to the new Renewable Fuel Standard Pathways, Revenue Opportunities for EVs and Utilities. This afternoon we have 4 speakers, myself included. Jeremy Martin, the Senior Scientist with the Clean Vehicles Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Stephanie Searle, Senior Researcher with the International Council on Clean Transportation. And Susan Lafferty and David McCullough, Counsel and Associate at Sutherland, Asbill, and Brennan. Our agenda today has 4 parts. We're going to have an introduction to the RFS, the history, the policy objectives, and who have been traditional actors in this sector. We're going to be talking about the new RFS pathway, its policy objectives, and some new opportunities and actors, a little insight into its potential value, how it links to electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging, and some of the financial components. And then we're going to close with a RINs framework and how to develop one in your jurisdiction, how RECs, RPS, and RFS all interplay. Those are renewable energy credits, renewable portfolio standards, and the renewable fuel standards. We'll talk about the audit trail of eligible electricity into electric vehicles and some of the opportunities for new partnerships. And then the 4th section will be a question and answer. We do have this from 12 to 1:30. We hope that you have questions and you'll use the chat feature in the GoToMeeting box to enter those questions, and we'll take them at the end. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jeremy Martin with the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about the Renewable Fuel Standard and just jump right in. So next slide. The Renewable Fuel Standard was part of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, bipartisan legislation to address oil dependence and climate change, with supporting both improvements in efficiency of vehicles and expanded production of clean fuels and especially biofuels. So next slide. And to us, this combination of focusing on improving the efficiency of fuel use, so previous slide, yeah, thanks, and also supporting innovative clean fuels is really the right strategy. And so we look at this as part of a comprehensive plan to cut projected oil use in half over the next 20 years, which is sort of what our objective is at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So in the next slide, you can see that we've already started to make some significant progress towards this goal. And so we've got a sort of a milestone of where we need to be in 2025 with the efficiency of our cars and trucks to deliver on this half the oil goal. And what you can see is that in the last 5 years, we've improved the efficiency of new cars and trucks by about 5 miles a gallon, which is, you know, a real departure from a few decades of stagnation. And so it shows that we absolutely can change our vehicle fleet and improve efficiency, and have started to do so. Of course, we still have a ways to go to fully realize the potential here. Next slide. And so that's just the cars and trucks that we drive, but of course all of the parts of the transportation sector can be improved in terms of their efficiency, and both using technology and with policies to support that technological progress. So keep going. Next slide. And so that's the efficiency piece, and we think it's always important to remember that that's the place we want to start, you know, not using any fuel that we don't need to, but it's not going to get us all the way to half the oil, and it's certainly not the only opportunity. We also have opportunity for innovative clean fuels, which we're going to focus on today. Next slide. So under this category of sort of innovation, we see a few big pieces. One is the electrification of the transportation sector. Another is next generation of biofuels, and the third is smarter transportation systems that can reduce demand, et cetera. And the first two really fit together in today's webinar. So let's go on. If we look at where we've come so far on biofuels, what you can see is after slow growth for a couple decades, things have really taken off in the last 10 years. And again, sort of putting up on the screen that benchmark we have of what do we need to do to realize our half the oil plan. You know, the rate of growth that we've seen in the last years is consistent with that goal, but that doesn't mean that all we need to do is keep doing what we've been doing. And this becomes apparent when we think about what the biofuels that we have today are. So next slide. So most of the biofuels in use today are made, ethanol made from corn is the largest source, and we're currently using about 40% of the U.S. corn crop, sending that to ethanol facilities. And the other large piece of that is biodiesel made primarily from soybean oil. And given the share that we're already using, we're not going to be able to make another 1.5 million barrels a day just with corn and soybeans, and there's lots of good reasons not to, not just the fact that there are other users for these crops, but also environmental impacts from expanding agriculture on a business as usual basis, and kind of globally, the expansion of the agricultural footprint has negative consequences. So we need to focus on a different kind of fuels as we move forward, and if we look at the next slide, that's exactly how the Renewable Fuel Standard was designed. And so you see that either one's fine, yes. As we look at the next decade of the Renewable Fuel Standard, the growth of the conventional biofuels, especially corn ethanol, is really not where the growth was anticipated to come from. It was supposed to come from a little bit from biodiesel, advanced, and cellulosic biofuels. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what these categories mean. So, of course, starting from the bottom, so corn ethanol, people are familiar with, and that's where most of the growth has come over the last decade. And I think it's cut off on my screen at least, but it is supposed to achieve a 20% greenhouse gas reduction, although existing facilities at the time the law was passed were exempted, grandfathered from that requirement. The next category is biomass-based diesel, typically biodiesel. It required a 50% greenhouse gas reduction and sort of specified only fuels which were blended into the diesel fuel pool. And then there's advanced biofuel, of which the biomass-based diesel is a subset, but this could also include fuels that were in other parts of the fuel mix. And so sugarcane ethanol is the one that people sort of anticipated would be a natural candidate here. And on my chart here, I've shown the blue and orange sort of shaded because EPA has discretion about how much of the advanced biofuel should be biodiesel and how much should be just left flexible for any fuel that meets the 50% greenhouse gas criteria to meet. Although there's one exclusion, which is that cornstarch ethanol is excluded from this category altogether. And then the last category, where the lion's share of the growth was supposed to come, was what's called cellulosic biofuel, and there's sort of two. And I've got these codes here, D codes, D3, D7, D5, D4. These are what are called the RIN codes, and I put them up here mostly for reference. They'll come up later on. But so cellulosic biofuel could go into either the diesel or the gasoline pool. It has to have a 60% greenhouse gas reduction. It has to be made from specific feedstocks, and in particular, these lignocellulosic biomass. What that typically means is sort of not food, not digestible material. So let's go on. So there's a couple issues that are challenging the Renewable Fuel Standard, and one of them right now is that vision there called for a very rapid growth of cellulosic biofuels, and that we're not achieving that rate of growth. So if we go to the next slide, what you can see is the growth was supposed to come from cellulosic. Keep going, but what we've really seen is that industry is growing, more slowly. There's some important milestones. First plants coming online now, making cellulosic ethanol and other fuels, but not at the rate that was envisioned when the RFS was put together in 2007. Next slide. So, we've looked at the underlying, kind of biomass materials to make this fuel, and I think there's not a fundamental reason we can't get, back one please, to the 36 billion gallons, but it's certainly not going to happen in 2022. It's going to take longer, at least till 2030 or so. So let's go ahead. And so the other issue challenging the Renewable Fuel Standard right now is what's called the blend wall, and this is simply a matter of that the volumes specified in this policy went way beyond what could be blended easily into gasoline in a 10% ratio. And so that's a transition happening right now, and that's requires different compliance pathways, and it's raising a question, if you go to the next slide, about whether, if it's the end of the road for ethanol because we don't have infrastructure to distribute E85, or we don't have the vehicles to use higher blends, what does that mean for the future of the policy? So next slide, please. And I think that the main thing it means is that because the infrastructure to distribute ethanol is constrained, the RFS is suddenly a very competitive landscape. And so, ethanol blended as E10 has been sort of the leading compliance obligation, followed by biodiesel. But with that constraint, now you have other options that are more competitive. So, landfill gas or biogas being used in natural gas-powered vehicles, renewable electricity, which we're going to talk about, all have the potential to compete, given that the advantages that allowed E10 to really run away from the pack are now, removed. And so it's a much more competitive situation. There are other opportunities for ethanol in different blends, for different things to be blended into gasoline, for different kinds of diesel fuels. But there's certainly this competitive environment creates an opportunity for the natural gas and renewable electricity as well. Next slide. So the last thing I want to point out is that the Renewable Fuel Standards, one of the most important policies in this area, but it's not the only one. There's a California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is very similar to the Renewable Fuel Standard, except that it's broader, and so it doesn't just regulate biofuels, it regulates all fuels, and it provides support for low carbon fuels across the transportation sector. It's also worth pointing out that this provides incremental support and an incentive to sell the cleanest fuels in California, but those fuels are also eligible from the RFS, and so the cleanest fuels essentially get support from both. Next slide. And other states, Washington State and Oregon, are also moving forward with very similar policies. So next slide, I'll just wrap up by saying that we can cut our projected oil use in half with efficiency, innovative clean fuels, and then chief among those are electricity and biofuels as sources of transportation fuel. Next. And when we do this, we cut our oil use, we move beyond food-based fuels to advanced and cellulosic fuels, and the E10 blend wall creates these opportunities for lots of non-ethanol biofuels as well. And really, when we do this, when we cut our oil use, we cut all the problems that we're well aware of that oil causes for our economy and our security and our climate and our environment. And the last piece is cut off there, but the point is that low carbon and clean fuel standards in other states are similar to the RFS, but are more flexible and have a broader reach. But I think because of the similarities, investments made in figuring out how to work with the RFS are going to have application in these other areas as well. So that's all I've got. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. And next we have Stephanie Searle from the International Council on Clean Transportation.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar. So I'll be going into some aspects of the RFS in a little more detail, including traditional actors, an introduction to the pathways processed under the RFS, and a little bit about the broader potential for renewable electricity to access RFS support. Next slide. So first I'm going to go over the traditional actors in the RFS. EPA, of course, is at the center as the regulator of the RFS. This agency is in charge of implementing the program. This includes updating the RFS every year, approving all new pathways, and enforcing the RFS. Obligated parties, or the parties who must comply with the RFS, are fuel suppliers and blenders, or basically oil companies. These companies must either buy and blend biofuel into their fuel mix or purchase Renewable Identification Numbers, or RINs, to show compliance. I'll go into a bit more detail about RINs on the next slide. The producers have traditionally been biofuel companies who sell biofuel and RINs along with it. These are the parties who receive the financial support created by the RFS program, and this is where utilities can now fit in. Next slide. I'm going to take a detour to go into a little more detail on RINs, or Renewable Identification Numbers. These are basically RFS credits. RINs are generated by biofuel and now also by biogas electricity, and oil companies are required to submit RINs to EPA for compliance each year. This is the mechanism of supporting biofuel producers under the RFS. RINs are tradable, and since utilities are not obligated parties themselves under the RFS, they may sell all their RINs to other parties, for example to oil companies. So this graph shows an approximation of cellulosic RIN value over the past couple of years per gallon ethanol equivalent. And as you can see, RIN values can provide a substantial level of support, but these prices are somewhat unpredictable, which makes it tricky to project how much revenue will be generated by a certain amount of biofuel or biogas electricity. Next slide. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk about RFS pathways for the remainder of this presentation in order to provide some background on the new biogas electricity rule that was just finalized, and that will be discussed in more depth in the next presentation, and also to set the stage for the possibility of other electricity pathways that could be potentially approved for RFS support. Any biofuel process, from feedstock and processing technology to fuel type, is a pathway that has to be approved by EPA in order to qualify under the RFS. So anytime a new combination of these elements is introduced, someone has to petition EPA for approval before that pathway can generate RINs. EPA will decide whether to approve or deny the pathway depending on whether it meets all RFS requirements, including the greenhouse gas reduction thresholds Jeremy talked about in the last presentation. If EPA believes the new pathway might have negative indirect impacts, it must undergo a full life cycle analysis. Next slide. This slide shows the main pathways that have been used to comply with the RFS so far. Corn ethanol, soybean biodiesel, and sugarcane ethanol were all pathways approved when the RFS was first introduced in 2010. While, as Jeremy explained, the cellulosic volume under the RFS was originally intended to rise to very high volumes over the next few years, not many companies have succeeded in producing large volumes of cellulosic fuel. This means there is a wide open opportunity for any technology for cellulosic fuel that can be scaled up to receive support under the RFS. Next slide. Now I'm going to give a couple of examples of new pathways of interest that have recently been approved and are in the pipeline. Last year, EPA approved a few new pathways for ethanol and renewable gasoline made from cellulosic feedstocks that had not been included in the RFS before. These are giant reed, or arundodonax, and Napier grass. And of course, a couple of months ago, EPA approved electricity and renewable natural gas from biogas, as the next set of panelists will cover in more detail. EPA is currently considering a new pathway that may be of interest to utilities, cellulosic biofuel made from wood chips. Wood chips could also potentially be used to generate electricity for EVs, or electric vehicles, through co-firing or other processes. However, it's not clear whether EPA will approve this wood chip biofuel or not. There are concerns about potential negative indirect impacts if wood chips are diverted from existing resources. How EPA comes down on this decision will be a good indicator of whether or not a pathway for renewable electricity from wood chips could be approved. Next slide. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about creating new pathways. This is the process that would have to be undergone to approve woody biomass electricity or other new electricity pathways. Someone, and this could be a utility, a farmer, or any other party, can submit a petition to EPA for a new pathway. EPA will consider the new pathway in light of its expected greenhouse gas reductions, feasibility, and other potential impacts. New pathways would then go through public comment before approval. Next slide. The process for approving new pathways has been slow. It can take up to 2 years. This is because EPA has received far more petitions for pathways than they expected. The agency is currently working on streamlining the process to make it easier and faster. EPA has suggested that petitioners for new pathways hold off until they have finished the streamlining process, which will hopefully be sometime this fall. Next slide. So this new biogas pathway is the first time electricity has been brought into the RFS, but there is certainly potential for utilities to play a larger role through additional pathways. Cellulosic RINs could in theory be produced from electricity generated through other processes using municipal solid waste, forestry residues, or crop residues, all of which would be sustainable pathways and would deliver high greenhouse gas savings. Again, these pathways would have to undergo the petition process. EPA has greatly reduced the cellulosic mandate in every year of the RFS, but this doesn't mean that the opportunity to generate cellulosic RINs from electricity is limited. So far, EPA has always set the cellulosic volume at the level they expect to be produced that year. So if eligible renewable electricity production takes off, EPA will increase the cellulosic mandate to that level and would require oil companies to purchase that number of RINs. So there is decent certainty that if RFS-eligible renewable electricity is produced and used in electric vehicles, it will receive policy support. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next presentation, and thanks again, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is Karen. I'm going to speak a little bit about the policy objectives and the new actors with this new pathway. So the policy objectives that are written into the rule talks about many changes in today's rules will facilitate the introduction of new renewable fuels under the RFS program. By qualifying these new fuel pathways, this rule provides opportunities to increase the volume of advanced low greenhouse gas renewable fuels. EPA's analysis shows significant life cycle greenhouse gas emission reductions from these fuel types as compared to the baseline gasoline or diesel fuel that they replace. So the policy objective is to recognize these new fuel types, as Stephanie was talking about, increasing the volume of advanced renewable fuels and ultimately reducing the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. This new pathway has the potential to provide notable volumes of cellulosic biofuel, and the resource potential for biogas in our country is significant and underutilized. The methane potential from landfills, animal manure, wastewater, and industrial, institutional, and commercial organic waste is estimated at around 8 million tons per year. Most of this methane is currently venting into the atmosphere as a potent greenhouse gas and is not being used. This is a map that NREL has put out about the methane potential, and this is just the methane potential in our country from wastewater, animal manure, landfills, and industrial, institutional, and commercial organic waste. So as you can see, it's fairly spread around the country, and it is quite substantial in some areas. The new actors, as this slide shows, includes dairy farmers who have not traditionally been seen as partners with electric vehicles. And yet this new pathway creates a direct line from a dairy farm, in this case, to an electric vehicle. Now, utilities and farmers have worked before together on generating electricity from methane, but this is a new twist where it includes the connection to electric vehicles. Landfill operators have traditionally also worked with utilities on generating electricity, but this new pathway connecting it to electric vehicles provides a new revenue stream. And then municipal solid waste system operators are another new party to this renewable fuel standard. A little bit about electric vehicles and EV charging, which are really the end point of this renewable fuel standard. Up to now, we've spoken about the creation of biogas electricity, and in order to generate a RIN, it needs to be used in transportation, and in this case specifically, in electric vehicles. So electric vehicles in our country, we've seen a pretty steady growth since they first re-entered the market in 2011. This is a chart that is kept by the Electric Drive Transportation Association, and we're closing in on 250,000 electric vehicles at the end of August, the latest sales projections. So the electric vehicles are arriving and they're growing, and as I'll show in a little bit, the electric vehicle capacity is presently is far less than the biogas capacity. That is, we have far more biogas in our country than we do electric vehicles to generate that RIN. So some of the opportunities for a utility to consider when they're looking at this renewable fuel standard for biogas generated electricity is how they will incorporate the value of those RINs within their electric vehicle rates that they're charging to customers. As I mentioned, we have far greater biogas right now than we have electric vehicles. There may be a potential for the RINs to actually serve as incentives to get more electric vehicles on the road to generate more RINs. One RIN is equivalent to about 22.6 kilowatt hours. Our estimate is an electric vehicle that drives about 12,000 miles would use about 3,600 kilowatt hours a year. So one electric vehicle could generate about 160 RINs annually. Those are broad estimates, but to give you a sense of the size of the breadbox. So one of those, the value of those RINs, I know Susan Lafferty will be speaking about that, is quite dynamic, but that gives you a sense of 160 RINs for one electric vehicle. So I'm going to turn it over now to Susan to go into some more details about how do we actually generate these RINs from this new Renewable Fuel Standard electricity pathway.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And you can go to the next slide. Hello, and thank you again for listening to this webinar. My colleague David McCullough and I are with the law firm Sutherland, Asbill, and Brennan, and we are in our Energy and Environmental Practice Group. Our group works with clients on energy issues from all sectors, natural gas, electricity, liquids. The program we are discussing today, the RFS program, is housed within EPA's Mobile Source program. The Mobile Source program has historically dealt with gasoline and diesel, requiring over the last 2 decades cleaner gasoline and ultra-low sulfur diesel. Even under the RFS program, the primary renewable fuels have been ethanol and biodiesel. I raise this to point out that the officials overseeing the RFS program have extensive experience with liquids, but that is not the case with biogas and electricity. Therefore, it is particularly noteworthy that EPA has taken the recent strides in expanding the RFS pathways to allow for the use of biogas to make electricity to power mobile sources like vehicles. This has been greatly supported by the stakeholders who have worked very hard to educate EPA on the biogas and on how the biogas and electricity systems work, and therefore allowing EPA to maintain its robust RFS requirements even as it goes into new pathways that it doesn't have a historical background in, like electricity. So on the next slide, we look at an issue that is generally not regulated by EPA, the price of RINs. I'll also note that if I could predict the price of RINs, I'd be keeping it to myself and trying to register myself to get into this program. But I am going to try and give you some parameters by which you might be able to predict the price of RINs and therefore factor it into projects and contracts. While EPA, of course, assumes that RINs will be bought and sold for a price, the regulations themselves do not wade into these types of commercial issues, except with regards to cellulosic renewable fuel. The statute mandates for cellulosic renewable fuel call for large increases in the volumes of the fuel, as you saw on some of the earlier slides. But because the industry was not established when the statute was created, the statute also provides for the need to reduce the volumes. EPA is required to reduce the cellulosic volumes in a compliance year where the projected cellulosic production is less than the statutory volume. In that event, EPA is directed to sell cellulosic waiver credits in a volume equal to the reduced volume mandated. So this is a unique part of the rules where EPA does play a role in setting RIN prices, and this will presumably impact the price for cellulosic RINs generated from actual production. There has been very little production to date, so there is really no historical price data to review. Under the statute, EPA sets the price of a cellulosic waiver credit at the higher of 25 cents per gallon, or the amount by which $3 a gallon exceeds the average wholesale price of a gallon of gasoline. Under this calculation, the amount for the 2013 cellulosic waiver credits was set at 42 cents, with the reduced volume requirement set at 6 million gallons. 2014 numbers are still pending. I'm reviewing how the waiver credit works because even with the expansion of the cellulosic designation for most biogas, we are unlikely to meet the statutory required volumes anytime soon. So EPA will continue to be offering these waiver credits in the next few years, even as new projects come online. Some more pieces to consider when trying to discern what a cellulosic RIN price will be is to look at the advanced biofuel RIN price and the biodiesel RIN price. Currently, these prices are essentially identical, about 49 cents. This is noteworthy because of the way in which the mandates work. They are nested such that a biodiesel RIN satisfies RIN obligations for 3 mandates: the biodiesel, advanced, and total renewable fuel mandate. A cellulosic RIN will do the same and satisfy 3 mandates: cellulosic, advanced, and total renewable fuel mandate. So it may provide some price point by looking at how biodiesel and advanced RIN prices track each other, with biodiesel perhaps selling for slightly more. Note there's also there's currently a surplus of biodiesel to meet its mandate, so the comparison is not 100% apples to apples. Also important is that a waiver credit purchased from EPA will only satisfy one mandate, the cellulosic mandate. It can't be used for other mandates. So we think it's safe to assume that a generated cellulosic credit will be more valuable than the waiver credit, although the creation of a liquid market may take some time and additional effort may need to be expended in the next few years to match up cellulosic RIN generators and obligated parties, so that obligated parties come to the RIN generators as opposed to just filling out a form and buying waiver credits from the agency. Finally, I'll note that there has not been price reporting on the limited number of RINs actually generated, cellulosic RINs generated, only reports on what the cellulosic waiver price is. We have reached out to some price reporting services and understand that some services like Opus are considering how and when to begin such reporting. So we assume that that will likely start taking place in the next couple weeks, given that the biofuel pathways have gone into effect and the 2014 standards are expected to be issued really any time now. So we can go on to the next slide to look at the federal and state interplay. As I think has been, was touched on earlier, the RFS does not preempt state programs. And as Jeremy pointed out, the California LCFS is a great example of that. Under the LCF, Low Carbon Fuel Standard program, credits are generated when transportation fuels with carbon emissions that are less than the annually set standard are imported or produced for use in California. So under that program, the same gallon of low carbon fuel can potentially generate both an LCFS credit and a RIN, of course, if all of the requirements for both are met. Similarly, EPA, under its RFS program, has not preempted any other state programs, including RECs and RPSs. This has mostly been the case by silence because the EPA RFS rules have not addressed these issues. But in the most recent preamble establishing the new pathways, EPA did actually address this issue head-on and noted that its program is not at all intended to preclude RIN generators from participating in state programs. That does not mean that there may not be other issues that need and hurdles that need to be surmounted in order to generate credits under two different programs, but as it stands now, the federal program does not prohibit that. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll get into the audit trail that Karen has mentioned, and this is quite extensive. David will give some further information on each of these points, but I'll start very high level with the note that these programs and requirements that EPA have established are quite complicated and quite serious. Penalties go along with noncompliance, and in the case of RINs, RINs are generally expected to be replaced if found invalid. So when establishing a program in which RINs will be generated, you need to consider hiring somebody internally, or several folks internally, or even perhaps externally, to be dedicated to compliance issues. It is something that EPA takes very seriously, and under this program, because of invalid RIN fraud issues, it is something that any participant needs to also take very seriously. So as you see here, there's a long list of requirements that are detailed in the Code of Federal Register, the CFR that you see a picture of here. In the next couple slides, we'll go over each of these in a bit more detail. So under registration on the next slide, there are some basic requirements that anybody participating in the RFS program will need to comply with. As noted here, all obligated parties, renewable fuel producers, importers, and exporters, and anyone that's going to own a RIN has to register their company. It's a pretty high, initially a pretty high-level registration in which certain corporate information is provided. And I'll note that if you're just buying biogas on the pipeline, but not buying RINs or selling RINs, you may not need to register. But certainly, whoever is going to be the producer of the renewable fuel, of the the feedstock, which in this case is the biogas, and the RIN generator will need to be registered. There are additional registrations under the EPA program, one called Part 79 and one called Part 80. The Part 79 registration is actually not required here because electricity from biogas is considered to be an alternative fuel. And the Part 79 registration does not deal with alternative fuels. However, Part 80, which is where the RFS program is housed, is a registration requirement for all participants. Note that there is a publicly available list of all entities that have a Part 80 registration that EPA maintains on a, as we understand it, daily, if not hourly basis, that by which you can look up and see whether any of your counterparties or potential counterparties are registered and what programs they're registered for. It's also a very good way to make sure that you are registered for all the right programs and activities under this program. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague David McCullough to get into some more specific information on registration under this program.
Thanks, Susan. As Susan mentioned, I'm David McCullough. I'm with Sutherland and represent a number of companies in this space. As Susan mentioned, all RIN generators need to register under Part 80 of EPA's fuels programs. Do not need to register under Part 79, which is the health effects testing requirements. Who can serve as the RIN generator in the case of biogas, or specifically in the case of this presentation, renewable electricity from biogas, has been an issue of some debate. EPA, in its most recent rulemaking, which is the subject of this discussion today, clarified the entity that would or could serve as RIN generator. And when I say clarify, I mean they left it open for a case-by-case determination. EPA had proposed to narrow it to a very specific entity along the chain of from the production of the biogas when it's put into a pipeline and taken off, burned for electricity, and then put into a vehicle. Instead, EPA noted the flexibility that those in the market were asking for, and has instead allowed this case-by-case determination. So if you're interested in generating RINs on renewable electricity, you do have some flexibility, but this will be needed to be vetted or verified with EPA. And it's an issue you should consider. But nonetheless, even though there will only be one party serving as a generator, the parties are free to share the value of the RINs along the chain of ownership of both the biogas and the renewable electricity. And as Karen mentioned, even give a discount to the customers who are ultimately using the renewable electricity as a transportation fuel. So if you are seeking to serve as a RIN generator, which while not the subject of this presentation, does carry with it significant liabilities, as a result there's usually one party that has both the credit and the experience in a transaction to serve as that RIN generator. That party needs to, in addition to the elements that Susan outlined, needs to submit the information on the slide. Chief among that, among those requirements is an affidavit that tracks the biogas as well as the renewable electricity from the point of production to its use as a transportation fuel. And that affidavit basically states that the renewable electricity is only being used as the renewable electricity that's used as a transportation fuel, on which RINs have been generated, is only being used as a transportation fuel. In addition, the RIN generator needs to submit information on quantities, efficiency, heat content, and conversion factors at play. That would turn to the next slide. So one aspect of this new rule, this new pathways, has been a clarification of what sources could serve as sources of biogas and be eligible for RIN generation. These are listed in the first bullet on the slide. These sources were eligible before this new rule, but EPA clarified the scope of these sources and that these sources are a feedstock to produce an ultimate fuel type rather than the fuel type itself. And so here we have listed landfills, municipal wastewater treatment facilities, agricultural digesters, separated municipal solid waste digesters, and waste digesters. Generally, why that's relevant is, as has been discussed several times now, you can generate cellulosic RINs on biogas that's converted to electricity. However, only 4 of these sources qualify for cellulosic RIN generation. The general waste digester category does not qualify for cellulosic RIN generation. Instead, that qualifies for the advanced biofuel RIN, which is what all of these sources qualified prior to the rulemaking. Now, we've discussed several times how this is a new rule that allows for the generation of RINs on electricity. What this rule did was establish a pathway, which is what Stephanie discussed, but the rules were always set up to allow for RIN generation on renewable electricity if a pathway was established. With that, we can turn to the next slide. Now, the way that generation of RINs for renewable electricity and any biogas source more generally is handled on the RFS depends if you're injecting or transmitting the biogas via a commercial distribution system or a direct distribution system. In all cases, an affidavit is required, and the RIN generator must ensure that the electricity on which RINs are being generated has been used as a transportation fuel for no other purpose. Now, if you're transmitting, in this case transmitting electricity, over a commercial distribution system, which includes a physically connected transmission grid, you have to obtain a couple of additional requirements, or meet several different additional requirements. One is that the transmission grid is physically connected, and the other is that the amount of electricity sold for use as a transportation fuel corresponds to the amount of electricity derived from the biogas placed in the commercial distribution system. Again, you also need the affidavit that's been mentioned several times. Turn to the next slide. Reporting, as Susan mentioned, the RIN generator must submit a number of reports related to the RIN generation activities. We're not going to discuss all of those, and they're another slide into themselves. Instead, we're just going to highlight the additional report that needs to be submitted by those that generate RINs on electricity derived from biogas. And those reports have to contain information on the energy used as a transportation fuel that's derived from biogas, and the location at which the fuel was sold for use as a transportation fuel. That information is reported on a pre-established form that EPA has developed on its website. Again, this is an area where consultants are frequently helpful, particularly for those that are not familiar with RFS or do not have a substantial compliance staff. You can turn to the next slide. Record keeping. This slide lists a lot of requirements, but I think we can just sum it up in that if you are generating any type of RINs, the requirement is that you keep everything. You keep everything, all the documents related to your generation activities, reports, contracts, and really any elements, any documents related to compliance. However, biogas, because of the nature of biogas, has a few additional requirements, and these are listed on the next slide. Turn to the next slide, please. Those requirements, these are record-keeping requirements, so these are not documents that you submit to the EPA, but rather you have several different additional requirements that you have to meet in the event EPA provides an audit of the company in question, and those, first of all, are documents reporting the transfer of title of the biogas / electricity from the point of production to the point that it's used as electricity in a transportation vehicle. You have to have documents that demonstrate the volume and energy content of the biogas and renewable electricity delivered to the facility, as well as the amount of energy and biogas that is placed into the commercial distribution system from which the biogas and renewable electricity is ultimately drawn. And again, you have to have an affidavit. This is a requirement that keeps popping up. But notably here, for record-keeping purposes, this is an affidavit that needs to be issued and obtained quarterly from each party along the chain of the transaction, from the point of biogas production from one of the sources listed on the previous slides to the point that the electricity is used as a transportation fuel. So that can be a little bit of a commercial obstacle or a commercial issue that needs to be addressed when you're setting up the transaction to ensure that you're going to be able to obtain that quarterly affidavit that the electricity in question was both derived from eligible biogas source and was used as a transportation fuel. And lastly, the RIN generator also needs to maintain the biogas producer's Title V certificate under the Clean Air Act, which is a permit issued by EPA. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David and Susan. So the next step really is going to be questions from you all. We do have a couple that have already come in. And I just sort of want to close it up with this new pathway providing new opportunities for some new partnership. I think most utilities have not been familiar with the Renewable Fuel Standard, and most purveyors of biogas have not been familiar with utility operations. So this is a real opportunity for these two sectors to begin to work together with electric vehicle owners sort of in the middle of it. So why don't I turn it over now? We have some questions. I'll start with the first one that we've received. It's a question whether anyone is talking about a national low-carbon fuel standard based on these pathway approvals. I know Jeremy or Stephanie, if you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. This is Jeremy. I'm happy to jump in. There's definitely been thought about a national low-carbon fuel standard. I guess, and it would broaden the kinds of pathways that would be eligible. At the time the RFS was being proposed, there was consideration to doing an LCFS instead. My sense of it right now is that, we don't have the political environment to take the RFS and make it more ambitious and broader, just given where things stand today. So I think we're going to have to see how these policies move forward in the jurisdictions that are pursuing them in California and Washington and in Oregon. And meanwhile, because the RFS has a lot of similarities with the low-carbon fuel standard, working through the RFS process, registering more different kinds of fuel and getting that whole system working and getting people familiar with it, I think this is all the right way to move towards, broader, more comprehensive policy over a longer time frame.
Thank you. And as a reminder, you can use the chat function in the box for any other questions. Here's another question. It may be, again, for you, Jeremy. It's a question about using biogas electricity for shore power or plug-in electric capabilities for trucks and truck stops and ships at berth.
Well, I don't actually have any specific information on this point, so I guess I'd ask if any other panelists have.
Maybe Susan or David, my understanding is that it needs to be used for surface transportation, and I'm not sure that a truck at a truck stop that's just using it to idle would qualify, but I'll let you speak to that more if you have some other thoughts.
Sure. This is David McCullough. I can pick that off, and Susan may have additional thoughts. EPA, in its most recent rulemaking, reiterated the fact that only fuel used as transportation fuel is eligible for RIN generation. Now, the definition of transportation fuel is tied to several different interlocking definitions within EPA's fuels program. And those definitions are arguably broad enough to include a number of different uses, including vessels, including a variety of truck transportation. And it is our position at Sutherland that it really is a case-by-case determination, but there should be allowances under the RFS, and there are in our construction, that RINs should be able to be generated on certain types of uses by water, for instance. But this is not an area that EPA has clarified. The only aspect that EPA clarified, and it was in its preamble in the final rule, was that use of renewable electricity or biogas in a train did not qualify for RIN generation. It would be, I think there are some arguments that if you were interested in pursuing even that level of use, you could generate RINs on that activity. But that would need to be an area that you clarified with EPA before proceeding. Susan may have additional thoughts.
You know, the only thing I'll add is when it comes to maritime use, EPA has recently been very proactive in trying to get bunker fuel cleaner. And you know, EPA and the United States, I should say, they're party to some treaties that go to that point. But the United States and with EPA implementing, with U.S. Coast Guard involved as well, has more quickly moved to adopt what's known as an emission control area, ECA, for essentially all of the coastal waters. And that is focused on lowering bunker sulfur levels down to 1,000 parts per million. And so EPA, in conjunction with this move, which is we're really currently in the phase-in right now, and by January 1, all vessels operating in U.S. ECAs should be operating on bunker fuel that's 1,000 ppm or less. EPA has clarified that if, for example, biodiesel is blended into a covered transportation fuel such that the RINs stay valid, and then that is further ends up in use in a bunker application, that those RINs will still stay valid. Because as some of you who are familiar with the EPA program, there are some different ways by which a RIN that has been properly generated can be considered invalid downstream because of its use in a uncovered area. But so, you know, I read that as EPA recognizing that this program, the RFS program, generally can also complement other efforts to clean up the air when it comes to mobile sources, and you know, look to how perhaps the use of you know, I don't know if it'd be electricity or maybe more likely an LNG or CNG fleet of, you know, ferries or other engines used in vessels. You know, there might be some pathways there that EPA would be able to entertain and approve at some point.
Thank you. We actually have 3 questions asking about a broadening of the RFS pathways for the consideration of wind and solar as electricity pathway. I'm not sure who wants to take that and talk about the EPA feedstock provisions. Stephanie, do you want to?
I can take that, Karen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so under the statute, under the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 that established the Renewable Fuel Standard program, it specified that eligible fuel must be derived from biomass. So this is a pretty strict definition that probably in almost all cases prohibits the use of solar, wind, or other things like geothermal to be eligible for crediting under the RFS. So the potential is probably very small for branching out that broadly. That being said, there is the potential for many additional new pathways that are biomass-based that could be included in the RFS, and some of those could certainly be related to electricity.
Thank you. There were some questions about who owns the RINs. I think Susan or David, you mentioned, I guess it was David who mentioned that the EPA clarified that by saying we'll take it on a case-by-case basis. Is that correct?
That's correct with regard to who generates the RINs. The party that generates the RINs is determined, as Karen just mentioned, on a case-by-case basis. Nonetheless, the party has to have, really be somewhat of an integral part of the transaction, meaning that they, the eligible parties may either be the owner-operator of the landfill that produces the biogas, or whatever the source of the biogas is, those that operate that facility, an owner of the biogas or converter of the biogas to electricity between its use, between the production of the biogas and its use as transportation fuel, potentially even the user, the end distributor of the renewable electricity to a transportation fuel use. This would be an aspect that was clarified during the registration process. But to your question of who can actually own a RIN, that is really, anybody can own it once generated. So once generated, that party can sell off the RIN to another party that's registered with EPA as a RIN owner. And really that could be anyone on this call register with EPA, and they can be up and running as a RIN trader. It doesn't need to just be the obligated parties, the importers, refiners, and blenders of gasoline and diesel. And it doesn't need to just be the renewable fuel producer. It can be any party that wishes to buy and sell RINs. RINs are viewed in one way a freely traded commodity, just like the fuel on which it was generated and produced.
Thanks. And we have a couple of questions about metering, probably from a utility perspective, noting that electric vehicles are not usually individually metered, certainly in a residential setting. How would that play out? Would you imagine that it would really be, to begin with, looking at public charging stations that you probably may have an individual meter for? How do you see an individual electric vehicle owner playing in this with their utility? Will you require, or does the rule require, a separate meter? And then there's some follow-up questions about the California Low Carbon Fuel Standards allows indirect measurement, but it would appear that this standard would not. Is that fair, that this needs to be a separate meter for the transportation use? I don't know if Susan or...
This is Dave. Yeah, this is Dave McCullough. I can, since I talked a little bit about that, I can handle it, and anybody else can jump in, obviously including Susan. This new rule clarified that two aspects. One, that you don't need contracts between all the parties involved in order for the RIN to be valid. You just can have an affidavit between the parties that the fuel on which you're generating RINs was used as a transportation. Nonetheless, you do need documentation supporting that use, the ultimate end use. Now, you can imagine a variety of different ways that would occur. One of which this isn't something that comes directly from the rule, but just something that I would suggest, would be if you have a public charging station, if there's a way, and I don't know because I'm not as familiar with how these operate, but I would imagine that there's some way of the charging station itself keeping track of how much electricity is taken off from that charging station. And if you know that charging station is only going to be used to power trucks, vehicles, other transportation uses, rather than, I'm not sure what the alternative would be, that someone could come and, I don't know, maybe charge their car battery, but again, that would be potentially a transportation use. So if you can attest to the fact that the charging station is only serving transportation fuel uses, that would be one way of doing it. Now, in-home charging certainly becomes more difficult because not only do you need the documentation in the event of an audit, you need the documentation in the event that there's some question as to the validity of the RINs down the line. As Susan alluded to, there's been a significant amount of RIN fraud under the RFS, and though it would be difficult to imagine, at least at this point, widespread fraud going on with regard to transportation, renewable electricity use as transportation fuel, because we don't have widespread distribution of electric vehicles. Therefore, it would be somewhat easy to detect if there was significant fraud going on. Nonetheless, you want to feel confident, you want the market to feel confident about the validity of the RINs. I think that would be an area, if you were seeking to generate RINs on the electricity someone takes off from their home and uses as a transportation to power their car, if you could establish some in-home monitoring system to flow that, or get documentation regarding the number of miles that the individual is using and that they're only powering up at home when they come back each way. The point being is that there's flexibility here, and I think there's the flexibility for some creative solutions along these lines. But it's something that if you are a utility or anybody else along the chain of ownership of the biogas or renewable electricity, you certainly want to consider, maybe not as an initial threshold issue, because I think it's a surmountable issue, but one that you consider when designing your compliance program.
Thanks. And we have a couple of questions asking about sort of the fuel mix from a utility where they may have a number of generation capacity, including some RIN-eligible generation from some landfill methane, say, or some on-farm digesters. How would they go about, a utility go about adding the RINs from when the electrons all get mixed on the transmission line? How do they assign a percentage or a value to that component of the electricity that is RIN eligible? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? If it's maybe
I can talk again, but
okay.
Maybe Susan, you have any thoughts? I've just handled the past few questions.
Sure. No, I can. This is Susan. You know, that all goes to the tracking that David covered on the slides and in some of these responses, where you know, where you need to be tracking the volume of biogas that's being collected from whatever source it's being collected from, you know, cleaned up and put into the pipeline or put into your facility to make electricity. And from there, using the proper conversion factors, I believe, Karen, that might have been covered in some of your materials, that's how you keep track of how many electrons were then generated or created from that biogas volume, and that biogas volume is what is the renewable fuel feedstock that is approved by EPA. So it's really all a series of documentations tracking where the biogas and then the electrons are traveling, or theoretically can travel, because of course, you know, molecules or electrons get mixed and might end up technically in some different locations than the, you know, the ultimate purchaser who's buying what they understand to be renewable electricity. But that's where all of the documentation and record keeping that David referenced is something that is either explicitly required by EPA or is just part of what your counterparties and or your internal best practices will probably require. So that's where via the linking of metering and other mechanisms by tracking the actual volumes or numbers of electrons, along with either the contracts or the affidavits by the purchasers and the users of those electrons, will go towards establishing the audit trail, showing, allowing you to keep track of what percentage of this was renewable and therefore can generate RINs. And as David said, under the recently finalized approach, EPA is allowing some flexibility for determining who is going to be that generator of the RINs, and presumably whether it's somebody on the front end, for example, who's gathering the biodiesel, cleaning it up and putting it on the pipeline, and perhaps from there going to various sources, or if it's somebody further down the chain, they are via commercial agreements going to make sure they're receiving all the right documentation from all the other players in the chain who may not directly be regulated by EPA, but who by virtue of their contracts have an obligation to provide certain documentation.
Thank you. We also have some other questions that get to the double dipping, or someone suggested even triple dipping, about the renewable electricity generating RINs and also providing compliance for a renewable portfolio standard, as well as participation in a low carbon fuel standard and generating renewable electricity credits. I believe, David, you mentioned that the RINs don't preclude that, and I guess my thought would be, the question would really be, do the RECs or the RPS preclude it? So we know from EPA that the RINs rule and the RINs pathway wouldn't preclude you double or triple dipping, but it may be that those other programs do. I don't know if someone has some further thoughts on that. Using RINs, biogas-generated electricity. Go ahead.
Yeah, Karen, I think that's right. I think the RFS doesn't preclude it. That's really a matter of federalism, and the fact that states are able to design their own systems. And there is a question of, you have to look at which RPS you're looking at, what the sources are that are eligible. In this case, really what the uses are that are eligible for REC credit generation, to see whether it's permissible. And it becomes a question of that. There's also the idea, too, that where you see a lot of selling of environmental attributes and the ability to turn gas, biogas, or electricity green or brown based on the sale and assignment of that those attributes. So I think the short answer is
And sort of flowing from that was whether every site generating biogas electricity needs to be certified in the RFS, or whether they can be aggregated. And I assume a utility could be one of those aggregators. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I would assume that they could be an aggregator.
I certainly have thoughts, but if somebody else wants to jump in before me. Okay, every generator of electricity from biogas that is going to, on which the biogas is ultimately going to be served as a basis for RIN generation needs to register with EPA. Now, because gas put onto a pipeline is fungible, and the molecules, you're not actually the molecules that are being burned by the power generation facility are not literally the molecules that, in most cases, that came out of a landfill, for instance. There becomes the ability to assign which, as Susan talked about, which molecules you're talking about are the biogas. And so you're creating a contract in between the marketer of the gas that comes out of the landfill to the utility who has the power generation facility. And it's that power generation facility. They need to, their facility itself needs to be registered with the EPA as part of the overall registration that registers the entire physically connected pathway between the biogas source and the use of the electricity as a transportation fuel. So if you have multiple power generation sources, you would need to register those sources. But it would seem to me that in most cases, and I'm sure there are cases that I'm not thinking of here, you could register just one power generation source and have that facility be for EPA purposes, be the facility that's combusting biogas and then selling on the electricity for use as a transportation fuel, provided that all those grids are physically connected and that you have the documentation.
And then we have a couple of questions dealing with the complexity and burden that this new rule would place on anyone wanting to generate RINs. And it's really a question about whether any utilities have seen any financial benefits. I would assume that there has been no biogas-generated electricity RIN generation to date. But just any sense of the requirements for needing a chemical engineer, all the reporting, whether or not there's a business case to be made for pursuing this from a utility perspective, or whether folks get the sense that that may be something coming down the road, no pun intended, that perhaps it's a market that hasn't yet been mature enough, but it's a new potential that may grow bigger. But if anyone has some thoughts on the weighing the pros and cons of the burden of this new rule in terms of reporting and audits and compliance requirements to the financial value from a business perspective for a utility.
You know, this is Susan. I can give some thoughts on that, just sort of generally with regards to what might the business case be, because it certainly is a very complicated program and compliance needs to be taken seriously. You know, that said, there's a lot of experience in this program. It's been in place since 2006, and so there are a lot of resources out there to get the help that you might need. And frankly, the hardest part is the first registration. So once you get through that first registration, then it just becomes easier. Now, some of the facts with regards to different projects are likely to be slightly different from project to project, but you'll know the process and know what you need and know who's going to help you get there. So that's where we see companies in the biogas area not just doing one project, but trying to line up several to do, because they just learn from the initial process and therefore are that much more efficient going forward. The program, as has been mentioned by several of us, has had some issues with fraud. That was in the biodiesel arena, though of course fraud in any one of the renewable fuel areas is always possible. And so along with this recent pathway that EPA finalized, they've also finalized a quality assurance program that allows for voluntary participation by producers of renewable fuel to have their RIN generation activities, which of course go hand in hand with their production activities, reviewed by an outside independent third auditor that then would verify the RINs. Now, For biogas and therefore for renewable electricity, I think it's safe for me to speak for David to say that we don't see that this is necessarily a program that anybody in this area is going to need to take advantage of anytime soon in order to show their counterparties and the eventual obligated party that buys their RINs that their RINs are in fact validly generated, and that's because the record keeping in this area for biogas is very extensive, and the preparation that you need to do for your registration in those regards is very detailed. And in our view, an obligated party is going to feel very comfortable with the validity of those RINs, those cellulosic RINs that they're buying, based on that audit trail that they probably through commercial documentation may be able to see occasionally themselves, or be purchasing from a counterparty, purchasing RINs from a counterparty that they know and trust has sort of done their own level of due diligence on the production of the RINs. So from a business standpoint, we see RINs from these kind of activities that we've been discussing today as valuable to an obligated party who must retire a certain number of RINs each year. And that's where we've seen a number of the larger obligated parties show interest in forming partnerships with biogas RIN generators so that they are exclusive or lined up to buy a majority of the RINs once they do start generating, because not only do they need them for compliance purposes, but they feel like there's a way to feel comfortable that the RINs have in fact been generated and been generated properly. So I think from that standpoint, and that's not utility specific, there's a good business case from that angle. And somebody else might have some more utility specific views.
And I'll just build off of that, Susan, to add that, as you mentioned, there's already substantial RIN generation going on biogas. It's simply that the biogas is used directly as natural gas to fuel natural gas vehicles. And I think approximately 40 million RINs are on target to be generated this year alone on that usage. The only difference here would be conversion to electricity and then use as an electric vehicle. Now, from the regulatory burden standpoint, there are clearly a number of parties out there, and we've worked with a number of them, that view that there's a business case and that the regulatory burden can be met. Now, it just becomes a question of incentives, and sort of strangely enough, the explosion in natural gas usage or production in this country, driven by new drilling techniques and fracking techniques, has created a real surplus of natural gas in the country, which has driven down the prices, such that natural gas, as I understand it, sells for about half the amount of gasoline and diesel fuel. So that's driving a number of fleets, UPS and FedEx, to convert to natural gas, and they're interchangeable when it comes to biogas. Now, as I think Karen mentioned, there's much less usage of electric vehicles. So I think this is really going to be a question of availability and usage of electric vehicles driving the ability to produce RINs on electric vehicles rather than the supply of biogas for those willing to meet the regulatory burden. Those entities are already there. So I think the question becomes, are there entities out there and those new partnership opportunities that Karen mentioned that can think of creative incentives and creative uses for electric vehicles?
So this is Karen. It could well be that utilities who have a large amount of biogas-generated electricity may get a call from one of the obligated parties looking to partner with them if they have a number of electric vehicles in their region as well, to provide them with their RINs credits. That may be another thing that occurs. We do have another question that I don't know if Stephanie or Jeremy, you may have some insights into, and this really takes us in a slightly different tack, but it was whether or not this pathway coming out of EPA has any connection with the new 111D utility rule also coming out of EPA. Do you have any thoughts?
Sorry.
This is Jeremy. I don't. Go ahead. Stephanie, did you have any comments? As far as
no,
I know,
I'm not familiar with you.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the 111D rule is certainly something the utilities are very familiar with, and its requirement to reduce the carbon intensity of electricity generation. I would assume that electricity generated from biogas would be potentially less intensive, and this new pathway for it to be used for electric vehicles may be helpful, but I think it's just an interesting connection potential there. We still have quite a few questions. I'm aware of the time. We have maybe another 5 minutes. We're going to try to get through the rest of these questions. Those that we don't get through, we do have your name and contact information, and we'll try to reply to them after the webinar. So one simple question is, where can RIN values be tracked? Is that something, Susan or David? Is it on the EPA, or where's the best place to track RIN values?
This is Susan.
Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for the cellulosic waiver credit price, that is something that EPA will establish. Presumably they'll establish it shortly after they announce the 2014 standards. They'll establish it for 2014, and that will be on EPA's website. For competitive pricing out in the marketplace, that is something that is not currently being tracked. Opus and Argus and some other reporting services provide RIN pricing for the other types of RINs currently, and we have reached out to them to ask about cellulosic, and we understand that they're considering now how and when to start reporting those prices. So we would sort of imagine that, given the fact that this pathway rule is in effect and that the 2014 standards are presumably coming out in the next few weeks, which will likely have, create a renewed interest in the program, and we might see some RIN price movement based on that announcement. I would sort of guess that Opus and Argus and perhaps some others will see the value in starting to report those. I think some of the challenge, of course, is going to be how quickly can they tap into a liquid market, or somewhat liquid market, so that they have something other than just 2 or 3 transactions to report, and that's where they're just sort of trying to wrap their arms around the how. But those are the places I'd look, and feel free to reach out to me or David in a couple weeks if you're still looking and don't see anything. We'd be glad to let you know if we've come across a service that is reporting.
Great.
This is Dave. Just to add, the Argus and Opus prices, those are pay services, and they're really great services. If you're looking to just get a snapshot on a daily basis, there are a couple of free source services out there. One of them is run by Progressive Fuels Limited. You can check that out.
Great. Thank you. So one of the questions has to do with the revised RIN QAP, and will they eventually apply to renewable electricity RINs too, or just the liquid biofuels?
The QAP program is initially it's just a voluntary program for producers of renewable fuel and the generator of the RIN. So right now, to my knowledge, only biodiesel producers are currently participating in some of the available QAP programs. The second thing to point out is these QAP reviews are conducted by third-party independent companies. such as Weaver and Genscape and Eco Engineers, and they apply for a general approval from EPA to conduct a QAP program, but then they have to submit at least for one pathway that they are going to review. So they might decide they just want to do domestic and just look at domestic biodiesel production. Another auditor might decide, well, we want to have imports be our specialty. So they're looking at all the imports coming in from, perhaps from Argentina and other countries of biodiesel. To my knowledge right now, there is not one of these companies has not submitted for a biogas pathway, and of course now they would have to add, a biogas pathway to renewable electricity. But that is certainly something that's possible. It really will be a function of demand, of whether or not these QAP providers see that there's going to be a market for it. And as David and I noted, we're not sure that there is going to be, at least in the short term, and perhaps even in the long term, if obligated parties, the ultimate purchasers of these RINs are comfortable with the validity of the RINs, such that they don't feel a need to pay even more of a premium for what would be called a Q RIN, a Quality Assurance Program Verified RIN, as opposed to just a cellulosic RIN that they know was produced via renewable electricity, for which there's a number of documents, record keeping, and tracking requirements that they feel comfortable gives them adequate protection from a potentially invalidly generated RIN.
Thanks. We just have a few more questions. One is, who is paid for the RIN? It's a question of whether it's the renewable electricity generator or the user of the electricity charging their EV. And I guess embedded in that has to do with this affidavit and whether or not a utility contract between a customer and the utility could serve as that agreement. But I'm getting to the question of where does this money flow to and from, and perhaps what role might regulators on the utility side have in determining how that money gets parsed out?
Sure. This is David McCullough again. The way the money flows is that ultimately as Stephanie referred to them, the oil companies, the refiners, importers, blenders of gasoline and diesel have to purchase these RINs. So they're the sort of last purchaser of the RIN. And there's always a question of how much of that cost gets passed down to the ultimate consumer, the consumer of gasoline and diesel vehicles, you and me for the most part, except those driving electric vehicles. There have been a variety of different studies out there going both ways. How much is absorbed by the refiners and importers themselves. Now, and I can't answer the question on the electric vehicle side as far as the value of that RIN, who gets the benefit of it. It's going to be initially the party that generates the RIN, and really it's however the private parties want to develop their financial transaction. EPA plays no role in it. The electric regulators, I think they may have some small role in terms of incentives, but I think you could get into problems of federalism and states trying to regulate a federal program if they start interacting about who may receive that value of the RIN, rather than just leaving it up to the commercial parties to design as they see fit, whether they give that full value back to the electric vehicle user, or they keep it for themselves, or they pass it back to the landfill or the source of the biogas, the farmer who is providing the agricultural waste for an anaerobic digester.
Well, thank you. We're at our time now, and I do note we still have some questions we weren't able to get to. Our plan will be to try to respond to you offline, but being respectful of everyone's time. I did want to thank all of our panelists, Jeremy Martin from the Union of Concerned Scientists, Stephanie Searle from ICCT, and Susan Lafferty and David McCullough from Sutherland, Brennan, and McCaskill, and Asbill, sorry. So this is Karen Glitman. Thank you very much for joining us today, and you have all of our contact information, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Bye.